Hello, welcome to Miniature Realms. My name's Stuart. The city-state of Nuln Army of Infamy is one of the most talked about parts of this book, so it's probably about time we painted some cannons. Not only has Nuln got some cool rules in the new book and a cool amount of lore, there's also some special rules that can make your artillery a little bit more flexible or defensible, as you can see with these entrenched position rules. And I really wanted to do something modelling wise with those entrenched positions as well. These are the old Forge World sets and they're really cool. And they're really hard to get hold of as well. And these pictures are taken from the Troll Trader website, where they have one currently available for £140. Regardless of how cool they are, I'm not going to spend that for what it is. And they're probably a little bit too big. Really, it's a special rule that's not even listing any terrain that needs to be added. Being a hobbyist and a painter and a modeler, I really wanted to do something just to act almost as a representation or a token that I could use on the gaming table, but also I could move out of the way if the game state meant that they were just getting in the way of the game and causing issues. So a small 25 by 50 mil, basically the old cavalry bases, were perfect. They cover the whole width of the cannon base, but there's also enough space to build something that looks pretty cool. Started digging around in my bits box and recently built some Rohan houses. If you don't play Middle-earth strategy battle game, you might be able to find some of those bits online. There's loads of wooden things, so wooden planks, leftover little ends, and there's barrels and things like that as well. And that's perfect. I quite like the idea that they've deployed in battle and they're making hastily made earthworks. These aren't the kind of fully made earthworks like in that Forge World example. This is, right, we need to build a defensive position quickly before the attack. So they're going to use the wood that's around on the battlefield debris, empty barrels and things from their stores. And I just got to build them up really. It's really simple. There's even a little bit of fence left over from that same Rohan kit as well. I like the idea there was a bit of a fence and they built up and added a few more bits of wood around it. I didn't give it too much thought, got the super glue out and just built them in a fairly haphazard way. Like I said, if they built these defences in a hurry, and I just think they do the job. I've built 4, so I've got a spare one that's going to go with my halfling hot pot stroke mortar when I build the rest of the army. Well, that's already painted now anyway, but these are fun and I'll come back to the painting on them a little bit later in the video. And it's time to start painting the crew. Now I'm using Death Reaper and Dungeon Stone from the Tooth and Coats range. However, I've used this paint scheme in my recent Empire Handgunner tutorial, and then also the same scheme in my recent Imperial Dwarf tutorial. So I'm going to cheat a little bit here and not repeat those same processes, because I know so many of you watch all of my videos or all in a certain theme, and the last thing you want me to do is repeat exactly the same techniques over and over again. So I will break it down and speed it up a little bit here while talking about the theme and things, and I'll spend a little bit more time when we talk about the guns. Now I am painting a gun here, as you can see, and I decided that I wanted the wood to be painted black, part of the Nuln theme. There was 2 ways I was going to do it: either go for very black iron cannons and then the lighter wood to match the guns for my handgunners, or go as if they painted the wood black. And as it's the Imperial Gunnery School in Nuln, I thought they're going to paint the wood black and tie it all in with the black uniforms of Nuln, so that's what I did. But I'm using those 2 paints to build up almost Zenithal-like, so I really want to speed up the black process, and again I talk about that a lot in the handgunner video. But I'm using the same method on the wood and on the uniform, so the black prime, then the first layer of grey, a very dark grey, and then the slightly lighter one, which I'm really trying to keep from the top down, apart from on the guns when I focus in the middle of the panels just to artificially lighten them a little bit. We will go back and do some other detailing later on, and for the guns themselves there's going to be lots of weathering as well. Now I still had some grey in the airbrush, so I decided to use them on those little entrenched positions that I've built. They're going to be Zenithal anyway, but if you're going to Zenithal with white and you've got some grey there as well, it's very handy to build up that layer slowly. So I thought I'll go with the grey first, really build up those layers and make it a really neat, smooth transition towards the white. And by the time I am adding that white, it looks very much like any Zenithal you may have seen on my channel before. But if you're new to Zenithal, what I'm doing here really is mostly top down, but also a bit from the sides as well. And I'm building up a thin layer of white, slowly building its intensity, so that when I apply glaze type paints, it really shows through, giving you a really nice lighting effect. And then once those Zenithal layers with the airbrush are done, I've got a little bit of white paint on my dry brushing palette, or my dry brushing texture palette. Very, very dry brush here, and I'm just going to pick out the details with an all over dry brush. And I really want to hit the edges and the wood grain, because again, that really accentuates that detail when I add those glaze layer on afterwards. And this is a la Slap Shop, which has been made famous by the Honest Wargamer, but the technique's been around for a very long time and it's great. Do use it, it's brilliant. So again, this is slightly covering ground that I did on those previous tutorials. So the black recipe, this is Black Legion from Citadel Contrast Paint, a little touch of water just to help the flow. Now, because I've built up some grey layers on that black, rather than going straight in and edge highlighting, which you may often do with blacks, I'm going the other way. It's a lot easier to paint in black in between the folds, a thinner paint like a contrast, you're almost glazing it in, the shadows, than it is to do a really thin line on the edge. And this boosts the grey and the highlights that are there already by adding more shade. So it's a sort of a reverse way of doing it. It's a little bit easier. You can go on and then do further edge highlights as well, and I do a little bit on certain areas on these, but I find you don't need as much. And if you're doing army painting and you really want a striking army and you've got a lot of inventory to paint, it's a very quick way of doing quite a neat black uniform. And you can see here on the cannons as well, I'm just going in around the edge of what will be the metal areas on those guns, around the edges of the wood where it will be a little bit more shadowy, and I'm just doing some black lining there with this same mixture. So this is Barbarian Brawn, Dwarven Skin and Elven Skin from the Two Thin Coats range, followed by Shyish Purple and Vulpus Pink. I think in the original tutorial I used some Vallejo Express Colour Purple and a sort of pinkish colour as well. I'm just using these at the moment because they do pretty much the same job, so showing different ways of achieving the same things. For the first part, the triad of skin colours, I'm layering up very traditionally, so your base, your mid-tone and then your highlights. For each layer I'm decreasing the amount that I'm highlighting, so it's obviously an all over covering for that base tone. By the time you get to that mid-tone, you're leaving the dark in the recesses but lightening up probably about 50, 60, maybe even 70% of what you've painted before, depending on what part of the miniature you're covering. So you're looking at the cheekbones, the forehead, the nose, the tops of the hands, the fingers, rather than the gaps in between the fingers and so on. And then you move on to that top highlights and really want to decrease the amount that you're adding little lines there. So just across the top of the bridge of the nose, just across the top of the eyebrows, that kind of thing, maybe the knuckles or the thin edges of the fingers. That point I usually go in and paint my eyes, bit of black, bit of white, bit of black again, because if I mess it up I've still got those things on my palette to fix it. And then I'll also use those glazes, so that Shyish Purple and the Vulpus Pink thin down on the wet palette. The purple goes in all the shadowed areas around the edges of the cuffs and things, and then the red across the nose and the cheeks. Again, refer to those painting tutorials for a proper explanation. Two Thin Coats again, and this is Berserker Red, Sanguine Scarlet and Demon Red. And again, this is a colour scheme that's covered in those previous two tutorials, so I'm going to do a sort of speed version of it. But the same as with the skin, we have three paints there, a base, a mid-tone and a highlight. So an all-over coat of the base, and then slightly less of the mid-tone and then the highlight. And it's a spot colour for the army, the secondary colour behind black probably for most Nuln armies. So I'm being a bit random where I put it, so this particular miniature, just one trouser leg in a halved scheme is going to be red. As you can see, when we get towards that top highlight, that it really starts to pop and look pretty cool. Another thing you can do is, if you've got these sort of flannelled areas where you've got the inlays a different colour, you can make that black if you've got red over the top, so you're actually just painting on the raised areas, leaving some of that black showing, and that does the job for you. But sometimes I choose it to be a red undershirt or something like that, and in other times the red is the inlay colour, and I'm just with a smaller brush very carefully painting in between the gaps on those puffy shirts. Sticking to my two thin coats triads, was a grey, Carcharodon grey and Shrewper white. The reason I've got these is because I want some white shirts, and because we've started from a black base and then highlighted up to grey, we've got to paint the white in from the lowest level. Whereas if I start from a Zenithal, I'll go quite heavily on the Zenithal, and I've got a good base white there already. This is the opposite. So I'm working my way up again in layers from grey to white. So I've got the odd white undershirt here or there. On the troops, this takes a lot longer. So this chap here has a completely white shirt, so it takes a little while to build this up. But the overall time saving with doing the black the way I have with the airbrush far exceeds the having to paint in a white shirt like this. So this is Fury Green, Gung Ho Green and Green Beret, another triad, and it's just to add a little bit of variation. If you look at things like the old uniforms and heraldry guide for Empire, even with Nuln, with mostly black and red there will be the odd man with a brown shirt, the other one with a green or something like that. And this is just a way of adding a little bit of variation. They have a uniform, but they're also wearing their own kit or whatever's available to them at the time. So this one chap here has got a green shirt. This is cuirass leather, boar hide and fur cloak, just a really nice brown triad for doing things like boots. There's a fairly dark brown depending on how high you push that highlight. I'm just using that on the shoes. I've also used these colours over Cygor brand contrast paint as well, but again, because we're starting from that black base, I'm not using contrast as the base layer for this. And this recipe again was covered in that handgunner tutorial, and I believe in the Imperial Dwarves as well. Here we have Noble Steve Brown, Dry Rust and Satyr Brown. Just another example of a triad picking another leather area. So we've got different white pockets and pouches and things like that. And if I find when I'm army painting, using a paint range that gives you triads or groups of paints very easy to work together, just helps you work in batches, so you get a triad to work from and work your way down the set of miniatures, picking out the odd thing in those particular colours. Then you can put it away and move to the next. And when you've got a large army with hopefully lots of foot troops, not so much sometimes with Empire these days, but I've got enough in this army that I still want to approach painting in that way. A bit of Dwarven Gold and Game Air Silver here, but really just talking two shades of metallic, one a nice sort of gunmetal darkish iron colour and the other brighter for highlighting. And there's not an awful lot on these miniatures at all. They're not carrying a lot of weapons and things. One of my crews, I'm using the base for some state troops, so they've got a few more little trinkets, but these standard ones here, I'm just adding a little bit of metal to this sponge here and the ramrods and that kind of thing. I've decided also to make the wooden handles as black as if they've been painted to match the artillery guns and limbers, etc. Here's a selection of contrasts, browns, with always a green. I always put a sepia in as well. And this is my wood recipes that I do all the time at the moment. And again, if you want a detailed sort of explanation of how these work, check out my recent Rohan House tutorial. Check out my recent tutorial painting the Marienburg landship. There's quite a few times that I've used it in recent videos. And the idea, it works over a Zenithal. You thin these paints on a palette, so nearly 2 parts paint to 1 part water, so they're almost watery, almost wash-like, and you glaze them together when they're wet and you wet blend them, and you get this really nice kind of silvery old wood effect. And I use it all the time because it's super easy. It doesn't require any detailed highlighting afterwards, and when you've added a little bit of dry brush, some oil paints and things afterwards, it just looks so cool, and it just couldn't be easier. Now once they are fully dry, I'm using a paint here called Deck Tan, but it's a kind of off white, got a little bit of green tone to it. White would do as well, but I really like this paint. Again, old brush, extremely dry, and most of it off. And I just want to give it the lightest of dry brushes. If you see any streaking at all, you've gone too hard. It's just adding a touch of that detail back in, which is dulled by that glaze on the edges, but you really want to go super, super light here. Back to one of my more common metallic recipes, this time starting with the decayed metal. I'm still using the Dwarven Iron here. Sometimes I use black metal from the scale kind of range, the same as decayed metal, and then Game Air Silver as well. But I like giving it this sort of brownish undertone, and I leave a lot of it showing through, and it just gives a greater tonal depth to the metallics. It's just something I do a lot, and if you've watched my videos you'll have seen that a lot as well. But I'm base coating all of the metallic areas now across all the miniatures with this decayed metal. That includes all the trim on the ammunition casings, the little bits of trim on the gun limbers and the wheels and things like that as well. You've got the edges of the barrels, the metal strapping that goes round them, the little bits of metal that are on some of the fence posts on those little defensive positions as well. Then we're coming in with that dwarven iron or your mid-tone out of those, the normal dark steel colour, and I'm just starting to paint in over the top of that decayed metal, but deliberately leaving it quite patchy, making sure that that decayed metal is showing in quite a few places. It really adds to that kind of aged, distressed look of the metal. You can see that much clearer when we get to the larger parts on the weapons, the guns themselves, rather than just on those straps of the barrels. But I like the effect. The time you add some oil washes afterwards, it just gives you a really nice, realistic, gritty effect to your metals. By the time we get to the top highlight, the game air silver, it's quite bright, so I'm just being a lot more subtle with it. When it comes to the fence post, just the odd little scratch here or there, just at the top of the protruding spikes, that kind of thing. I don't really want to make it too bright and shiny after it all. It is just junk which they've built a barricade out of. By the time we get to the larger parts of the guns, I'm dry brushing it on those larger areas, but being quite gentle. I really don't want this to look too shiny. In so many cases, guns and things just weren't this shiny metal colour that had been painted, that had been sort of a deep blackish looking iron colour. So I've gone the opposite route in this. I do want them to look metallic, but I don't want to look shiny. I want them to look multi-toned, but only shiny on those edges. So in place of standardised washes like Agrax Earthshade or Seraphim Sepia, etc., I'm going to be using these ready mixed oil washes, dark mud and grease, in this instance from the Soilwork range from Scale Colour. I just prefer using these. If you do opt for using them, I would recommend trying to use an old brush. I'll cover that more in detail in other videos as well. But you see here, I'm not only going to be using it on all the metallics, I'm also using it on my bases, and I have already laid the start to these bases off camera when I wasn't filming at the time. I'm using a base texture mix from Vallejo that you could use anything like a Sterling Mud. There's loads of different shades and colours around. Let that dry. I've also stuck on little bits of kitty litter and a few little stones as well I have in my bits box. So I'm adding them to the bases as well as adding them to the metal areas. When we get to those entrenched areas, I'm giving it a healthy coat all over the mud areas. And this is grease, which is the lighter colour. I've saved the dark mud just for the metallics of the main guns. I want them to look a little bit greasy and dark. The rest I'm using this lighter tone. But I'm also painting in over the wood a little bit as well, because it's oil paint. It runs into those recesses in a way that a standard wash doesn't. So you can paint in with it, you can streak in with it, and it evaporates, and you don't get tide marks the way you would with normal paints, which is a really, really nice effect. So you're weathering as you shade at the same time. Is one of the reasons I like to use it. When it comes to things like the barrels, you can really let it run down into those recesses, knowing that it won't mess up your paint job quite the way that Agrax Earthshade would if you go a little bit heavier with it. Maybe when you use a standard wash, you like to go back and repaint in again to freshen up the area. You don't need to do that with oil washes. For a start, you can take them back off and tidy it up and control it a little bit easier. You can also wipe them off. Again, they also just run into the recesses a little bit more. So once you've played around with them a little bit, you start to sort of learn how versatile they are. As promised, I'm using that darker mud on the guns themselves and trying to be quite heavy almost on the main gun areas. They would be quite greasy, quite soot covered from all of the firing that they're going to do. And again, I'm going to wipe a little bit of this off from these areas, but I really want that paint on there in the first place. Just like the crew, I'm also using it to paint over the bases and those bits of kitty litter that is stuck on, and also those little bits of sort of broken stone and things. And I haven't painted those, and I'm allowing the oil paint to seep in and to colour those bits of kitty litter. I quite like the colour. Sometimes in the future I might want to paint them if I want a different effect, but for this army and my armies at the moment that I'm building for Warhammer the Old World, it's a perfect effect. And then I move on and wipe off some of that oil paint, like I said. Now, I've hair dried this. That or leave it overnight. You want it to be dry to the touch, but it does stay tacky and takes a long time to fully dry underneath with oil paints. So I'm just wiping off anything that stayed on the flat areas on the metallics. I'm leaving the rest, but wiping it off like this just takes the worst off, and you get this really nice sort of dulled, realistic looking metal effect. And because that's quite dull, I do like to go back and give it the lightest touch of dry brush, a bit like we did for the wooden panels with the deck tan, but this time we're going back to that Game Air Silver again. So the light is tickled just at the very, very top, just catches a few edges, has a little bit of pop back, but not too much, so you don't go to that shiny area. The balance is quite tricky sometimes. I'm brushing in dry pigment onto the bases into the detail, and then I blow that excess off, and it sticks in there really, really nicely. I'm not really putting it on flat areas and expecting it to stay there. I'm not adding any sealant either because it will change the way it looks. I'm deliberately putting it on dry so that I get that effect. There are other ways of doing it, I am aware of that, but I've done this for a lot of my armies, and this is perfect, and it just really draws it in all together and gives your bases a bit more of a multi-textured feel, a bit more of a realistic, almost military modelling style feel. So as I say, brushing it in vigorously, making sure it goes into all of that detail on the bases, and then you blow that excess off. And when you're finished, it's quite a cool effect. Well, I hope you agree anyway. With that stage done, I'm adding tufts. I'm using 2mm summer tufts from War Paint figures here, and I need to order some more because I run out now doing this artillery, and I've got a lot more army to paint. But I add them to all of the artillery crew, add them to the bases as well, as if they're growing up between those broken stones and things, and it just really adds a nice effect. Then some European mud effect from Vallejo as well. This is slightly different to the base textures. They come in the same size pots. They're really big. They're 200 grams compared to something like Sterling Mud. Definitely check them out. AK do similar things as well, but there are different effects. So do read the descriptions. Some very much are sort of sand-based textures, which is what I started with. This is more of an effect, and if you're looking for something to cover your whole base, you may find that this doesn't quite work the same way. But what I like to do with it here is add it on after those other areas, so it looks like you've got wet mud on there. You can add it around the wheels, you can add it on top of your tufts as well to really blend them into the bases. And these are all super easy, simple techniques. There's no painting skill here at all. It's about looking at the visuals of something and putting it all together on the base. Added a little bit extra onto those entrenchments. Obviously these crew have been building these up quickly. Maybe they've had a shovel there and they've dug up some wet mud in order to try and get themselves a little bit more protected. So added a little bit more as if it splashed up the side of the wood. And again, I think it just adds to the effect for these pieces. And then we are pretty much done. Again, for my armies, I like a nice black rim to my bases. You do you, whatever colour you like. But let's have a look at some proper pictures. I'm really happy with the way these came out. These are army painting. They're for my Nuln army, hopefully for the Throne of Skulls in February. I have a ticket, and I'll be producing a video very soon, actually, setting out my plans for that and giving myself a challenge to get it all done, including a display board in time. But we'll come back to that maybe as the next video, so do watch out. But these came out really well. I was happy with the little entrenched positions. Like I said, I wanted something that looked cool but wasn't too big that it got in the way in terms of gameplay, and these just plonking themselves in front of the cannons. If people charge from the front, I can just move that 25 by 50mm base out the way, and it's done. So let me know what you think of those. I'm definitely not claiming them to be anything particularly special. They are just junk stuck on a base, but hopefully it gives people some ideas of the way they might use things from their bit spots, and it just adds a little bit more flavour, but also gives you a way of representing a game thing, something that actually happens in game. And obviously if you move your guns, you lose your entrenched position in the rules anyway, so it'll only be set up when you deploy. But I think they look great, and it's just a nice fun thing to add. But let me know what you think in the comments. It's also fun, as you see here, just to line them all up in a row and put them behind. Obviously all four I made are in this picture. The fourth one is for my mortar, which has actually been proxied by a halfling hot pot, which I've already done a tutorial for that as well, so check that out if you haven't seen it already. Hopefully the Warhammer World Events team will let me take that and use it as a proxy for a mortar. If not, I'll probably have something else in my army, because the mortar is not exactly the best thing, but it's such a cool model, and it's the only fun way I think I can use it. So have a look out for that in that upcoming video, as I mentioned. Well, as always, thank you very much for watching the video. I hope you found something useful, something entertaining, and if you're still watching at this point, I imagine so, unless you skip forward hoping to find something good to watch. Let me know what you're doing for your own armies. Are you building Nuln? Are you just using artillery heavily in other provinces? Are you building entrenchments for your Nuln armies? I'd love to know how you intend to go about it, whether you're going to model it at all, whether that's in important or not. Love to see in the comments below. And if you haven't already, head over to the channel's Discord. It's a really nice place. You can just chat about all things wargaming and hobby related, and you can even share some pictures of your own armies in there, and I'd really love to see them. And if you have enjoyed the video, please do give it a like, drop a comment below. It really does help the video be seen by other people. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already done so. If you'd really like to support the channel further, please do check out my Patreon. There's a link in the video description. Multiple tiers to suit different needs depending on whether you want painting coaching or tuition, or just want to support the channel with a little bit of money towards me each month. Not so nice little perks as well, ways of earning dice, that kind of thing. Good fun stuff. There's affiliate links in the video description below as well. Knott's Hobbies for their wonderful dry brushes and their sponging tool, which is really cool. You'll see in a lot of my videos recently, and also for other companies as well. But thank you very much for watching. Take care, and I'll catch you soon.